I've spent most of my life learning that facts aren't nearly as solid as people think they are. People talk about truth like it's a brick wall. Something permanent. Something you can touch. But after what happened, after the crime that changed everything, I learned that truth is more like wet cement. Step on it at the right moment, and your footprints become part of the surface forever. I wasn't born a criminal. At least that's the version I used to tell myself. I grew up ordinary. Small apartment. Single mother. Cheap furniture that stayed in the family longer than some relatives did. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't violent. I wasn't one of those kids who enjoyed hurting people. What I was, however, was terrified. Terrified of being nobody. Some people fear death. Others fear pain. My fear was simpler and somehow more pathetic. I couldn't stand the idea of being forgotten. By my early 30s I had built a respectable life on paper. Stable job. Decent income. Friends who thought they knew me. A reputation carefully maintained through years of calculated effort. The problem was that none of it felt real. Every success felt borrowed. Every compliment felt addressed to someone else. And then came the opportunity. Even now, years later, I hesitate to call it temptation. Temptation suggests a choice between right and wrong. What appeared in front of me looked different. It looked like a correction. A chance to rewrite an injustice. At least that's how I justified it at the time. The crime itself wasn't born in a moment of rage. There was no dramatic argument. No sudden explosion of emotion. No desperate act committed in panic. It began with a document. A single piece of information. One fact. A fact that should have remained buried. The strange thing is that the crime wasn't really about stealing money, although money was involved. It wasn't about revenge, though resentment played its part. It was about replacing reality. About taking something that had happened and convincing everyone, including myself, that something else had happened instead. The phrase I kept repeating in my head was, "If everyone believes the new version, then isn't that the truth now?" Looking back, that's the first lie. Not the lie I told others. The lie I told myself. And once I accepted it, everything that followed became possible. I remember the exact evening when I decided to act. Rain against the windows. A half-empty glass beside my laptop. A folder open on the screen. And a realization so dangerous that it made my pulse race. I had found a way to change a story that people already believed. What I didn't understand was that changing a story is easy. Living inside the replacement is the hard part. Anyway, that's where this begins. Not with the crime itself. With the moment I convinced myself that facts could be substituted. That reality could be edited after the fact. That consequences only belonged to people who got caught. I was wrong about all three. A few weeks before everything happened, I was helping archive old company records. It was the kind of task everyone hated, hours of scanning forgotten paperwork and entering dates into spreadsheets no one would ever read again. That's when I found it. At first, it looked insignificant, an old contract filed under the wrong name years earlier. Most people would have skimmed past it. I almost did. Then I noticed a discrepancy. The contract contradicted a version of events that everyone in the company accepted as fact. Promotions, ownership percentages, even the history of a major project rested on information that, according to this document, wasn't entirely true. The mistake had existed for years. Nobody questioned it because nobody had reason to. I should have reported it immediately. Instead, I copied the file. I told myself it was curiosity. Then I told myself it was insurance. The truth was simpler. For the first time, I possessed information capable of changing someone's future. And once that thought entered my mind, I couldn't get rid of it. For several days, I did nothing except think. The copied document sat on my laptop, untouched. Every morning I told myself I would delete it. Every evening I opened it again and stared at the same pages. What bothered me wasn't what the document said. It was what it could do. I started noticing how much of daily life depends on accepted versions of events. Most people don't verify anything. They trust records, memories, and whatever story has been repeated the longest. The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that the company's official history wasn't real history at all. It was merely the version that had survived. That idea became an obsession. I began collecting publicly available records, comparing dates, reading old announcements, and tracing how the original mistake had spread over the years. Each discovery made the situation feel less like a clerical error and more like a hidden injustice waiting to be corrected. At least that's how I framed it. In reality, I wasn't searching for the truth anymore. I was searching for permission. People imagine that crossing a moral line feels dramatic. For me, it felt ordinary. One evening, after everyone had left the office, I sat alone reviewing archived materials. The building was quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioning. I remember looking around as if someone might be watching, even though I knew nobody was there. That was when I made my first deliberate decision. Not the crime itself. Not yet. I simply organized information. I created a private folder containing copies of documents, notes, and timelines related to the discrepancy. Nothing illegal about that by itself. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But the purpose had changed. I was no longer preserving information. I was building a narrative. As the folder grew, I found myself arranging facts according to the story I wanted to tell rather than the story that actually existed. Contradictory details became inconveniences. Supporting details became proof. The process felt strangely satisfying. Looking back, that's what scares me most. Not the lie. The ease with which I began believing by that point, I was spending more time thinking about the discrepancy than about my actual job. I stopped seeing documents as records of what happened. I started seeing them as tools that shaped what people believed had happened. The distinction sounds small, but it changed everything. The more I studied the situation, the more I became convinced that reality itself was fragile. A date entered incorrectly. A report filed under the wrong category. A forgotten email. Entire careers could be built on mistakes nobody remembered making. I wasn't motivated purely by money, though there was certainly a financial benefit if events unfolded the way I hoped. What drove me harder was the belief that I understood something everyone else had missed. That feeling is dangerous. It makes you think you're the smartest person in the room. I began rehearsing conversations in my head. Questions people might ask. Doubts they might raise. Alternative explanations they could believe. Without realizing it, I was preparing not to reveal facts. I was preparing to sell a version of them. Before making any major move, I wanted to know how people would react to the story I had constructed. So I started small. During casual conversations, I'd bring up pieces of company history and ask innocent-sounding questions. Nothing direct. Nothing that would attract attention. Just enough to see what people remembered and what they accepted without hesitation. The results surprised me. Most people weren't certain about the details at all. They remembered fragments, assumptions, and second-hand accounts. Whenever someone sounded unsure, another person would confidently fill in the gaps, often with information that wasn't entirely accurate. Nobody checked. Nobody questioned the source. The version repeated with the most confidence usually won. That realization gave me a rush I still remember. For the first time, my plan felt possible. At the same time, a small voice in the back of my mind kept warning me to stop. It reminded me that I was no longer investigating a mistake. I was preparing to exploit one. I ignored that voice. It became easier every day. And that frightened me less than it should have. There wasn't a single dramatic moment when I decided to go through with it. Instead, there were dozens of small decisions that added up to one irreversible choice. I remember sitting in my apartment late at night, reviewing my notes again. By then, I had spent weeks refining the narrative. Every inconsistency had an explanation. Every obvious question had an answer prepared. The story felt complete. Too complete. That should have been a warning. Real events are messy. People forget things. Records conflict with one another. Yet the version I had assembled fit together almost perfectly. I wasn't uncovering reality anymore, I was editing it. Still, I convinced myself that I was exposing a deeper truth. The next morning, I shared part of the information with someone whose opinion carried weight inside the company. I presented it carefully, framing it as a concern rather than an accusation. The reaction was immediate. Questions started spreading. Doubts appeared where certainty had existed. As I watched it happen, excitement mixed with fear. Because for the first time, the story was no longer mine alone. One thing nobody tells you about deception is that, once it begins spreading, other people often become more effective at it than you are. Within days, conversations were happening throughout the company. People discussed old decisions, questioned timelines, and revisited events that had been considered settled for years. What surprised me was how quickly everyone started adding their own interpretations. A minor inconsistency became evidence of a larger problem. A forgotten detail became a suspicious omission. People connected dots I had never intended to connect. I should have felt relieved. The story was gaining momentum without my involvement. Instead, I felt uneasy. The narrative was evolving beyond my control. Whenever I heard coworkers discussing the situation, I listened carefully while pretending not to care. Some repeated my version almost word for word. Others exaggerated it into something far bigger. Meanwhile, management began asking questions. Formal questions. The kind that generated meetings, reports, and investigations. That's when the excitement started fading. Because an idea had become a process. And processes leave records.at first. Management simply requested old records and interviewed a few employees. I wasn't concerned. Most of the information supported the narrative that had taken hold, and the original mistake was real enough to give everything an appearance of legitimacy. Then an unexpected problem appeared. A retired employee came back into the picture. Someone remembered that he had worked on the project years earlier and contacted him for clarification. I had never considered him a threat because, frankly, I had forgotten he existed. That was my mistake. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't relying on rumors or archived summaries. He had actually been there. According to coworkers, his recollection didn't match several assumptions that were now circulating. He remembered details nobody else mentioned and questioned conclusions people had begun treating as facts. When I heard that, my stomach dropped. For the first time, reality was pushing back. I spent days wondering what he might say next, replaying scenarios in my head. The story suddenly felt fragile. And I realized how much I had come to depend on it surviving. The retired employee's statements didn't destroy the narrative, but they did something almost worse. They introduced uncertainty. People stopped speaking with confidence. Instead of saying, "This is what happened," they started saying, "Maybe that's what happened." That single word, maybe, became my enemy. I found myself monitoring every conversation I could. If someone mentioned the former employee's version of events, I'd casually point out inconsistencies or suggest alternative interpretations. I never directly attacked him. That would have looked suspicious. Instead, I did something far more subtle. I encouraged doubt. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent weeks convincing people to question one version of reality, and now I was trying to stop them from questioning mine. The stress was exhausting. I barely slept. Every email notification made my pulse jump. Every unexpected meeting felt like a potential disaster. Yet I couldn't walk away. Too many people had already accepted parts of the story. If the narrative collapsed now, attention wouldn't just fall on the mistake. It might fall on the person who helped shape it. For a while, I convinced myself that I was safe. After all, nobody could prove I had influenced anything. I hadn't made public accusations. I hadn't claimed to be an authority. I had merely raised concerns. That was the story I repeated to myself. Then I received a message asking me to attend a meeting. Nothing dramatic. Just a calendar invitation. Yet the moment I saw it, I knew something had changed. The meeting wasn't about the discrepancy itself. It was about how information regarding the discrepancy had spread through the company. Someone was tracing the timeline. Someone was asking who first introduced certain claims and where those claims originated. Suddenly, details I had ignored became terrifying. Emails. Conversations. Documents I had shared. Comments I had made in passing. Each one seemed harmless on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. During the meeting, nobody accused me of anything. The questions were polite, professional, and calm. That somehow made them worse. Because calm questions suggest confidence. And confidence suggests that whoever is asking already knows more than they're saying. The weeks that followed felt unreal. By then, the investigation had shifted focus. People were no longer debating the original discrepancy. They were examining how the narrative surrounding it had grown so quickly and why certain conclusions had become accepted before the evidence supported them. That was when I finally understood the real crime. It wasn't the document. It wasn't the rumors. It was the substitution of facts. Somewhere along the way, a possibility had transformed into a certainty. A question had become an answer. And I had helped that transformation happen. The worst part was that many people genuinely believed the revised version of events. They repeated it confidently because they had heard it from others who sounded certain. Reality had been rewritten retroactively. Not completely. Not permanently. But enough. When I was interviewed again, I tried to present myself as an honest employee who had simply shared information in good faith. Technically, parts of that statement were true. The problem was that truth, when carefully selected, can become another kind of lie. The confrontation wasn't dramatic. No one slammed folders onto a table. No one pointed a finger and declared me guilty. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, it happened in a conference room with fluorescent lights and uncomfortable chairs. By then, investigators had assembled a detailed timeline. Not just of the original discrepancy, but of the conversations, assumptions, and interpretations that followed. They weren't interested in proving that I had fabricated evidence. They were interested in understanding influence. That distinction mattered. As they walked through the sequence of events, I felt something unsettling. For months, I had been living inside the version of reality I helped create. Now I was being forced to look at the original record again. It was less dramatic than my narrative. Less satisfying. Less useful. And undeniably real. For the first time, I saw how many conclusions I had reached before the evidence justified them. Nobody called me a criminal. Yet sitting there, listening to the timeline, I felt more exposed than if they had. The strange thing about consequences is that they often arrive quietly. For months, I had imagined disaster in dramatic terms, public accusations, humiliation, instant ruin. What actually happened was slower, and, in some ways, more painful. Trust disappeared first. People who once sought my opinion stopped asking for it. Conversations became shorter. Invitations became less frequent. Nobody needed to announce what had happened. The atmosphere communicated it clearly enough. The investigation eventually concluded that the original discrepancy was real, but many of the conclusions built around it were unsupported. The narrative had outrun the evidence. I wasn't prosecuted or led away in handcuffs. Instead, I was left to live with something harder to measure. Reputation. Once damaged, it doesn't repair itself simply because the worst assumptions prove false. What hurt most was realizing that I could no longer blame anyone else. The chain of events had begun with my choices. Not one decision. Many. Small decisions that seemed harmless individually but became destructive when combined. And I had made every one of them. Years have passed since all of this happened. Most people involved have moved on. New projects replaced old controversies. New mistakes replaced old ones. The world kept turning, as it always does. But I still think about that period more often than I'd like. Not because I was caught. Not because of what I lost. Because of what I learned about myself. I used to believe deception required inventing falsehoods. What I discovered is that reality can be distorted without creating a single completely fictional fact. Sometimes all it takes is selective emphasis, convenient omissions, and enough confidence to make assumptions sound like conclusions. That's the danger. The line between interpretation and manipulation is thinner than most people realize. If anyone reading this finds themselves in a similar situation, my advice is simple. Be suspicious of narratives that make you feel powerful, righteous, or uniquely insightful. Those are often the stories most capable of blinding you. The truth is rarely neat. It is usually incomplete, inconvenient, and unsatisfying. But once you start rewriting reality to improve the story, you may eventually discover that the story has rewritten you instead.